Hello, everyone, and welcome to my latest video titled, What is a Trauma Spiral? So, you probably heard this term, a trauma spiral, before. We go down this sabotage train where we're moving along in our life, and then something is activated, and we just totally derail the fucking shit. We just totally go way out of bounds. We go way off road in our life. What that means is that something has been activated in our system from the past. Something has been triggered somatically that is reminding the body of some past memory. So what so often is happening for so many people is that we are filtering our reality through our trauma, through the story of our trauma. Obviously, at the root of our trauma, there is something that happened to us that is not, in fact, a story, right? There's something where we experienced a form of injustice, that we were a victim, that we experienced some unfairness, whatever it might be. So there's actually an experience or many different experiences where there was a break in connection. There was a trauma that occurred. That is not a story. The root of the experience that happened in our life is not a story. But what happens is that we continue, particularly if we don't actually heal this trauma, we continue to move along in life, and essentially that trauma becomes our own sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, where we continue to, find a way to filter reality through that trauma, through the lens of that unhealed trauma. Right? Because that trauma becomes something that's familiar for our body. It's an imprint. And so often we continue to recreate certain experiences, which almost become pleas for the body to try and heal this trauma. But these different situations keep coming, and, oftentimes we're not actually ready to heal the trauma. So we continue just to filter the trauma through the story. And when I say story, again, right at the root, this is not to discredit or gaslight someone's trauma, because there's a very real situation where we experience some form of injustice, some break in connection, something that wasn't okay. But what happens if that continues to go unhealed? We carry on in life, and then it does at some point become a story. And when I say story, is that the default pattern in situations that unfold in our life becomes to filter situations that maybe are not completely representative of that situation that occurred, of that main core trauma, of that main sort of break in connection that we experienced. And we filter different experiences that are not quite aligned with that experience, but we filter them through that trauma, and it becomes a lens, right? And this is where you hear that we kind of move into a victim consciousness, that even though we experience a trauma, it is our job to kind of learn to work with that trauma, to heal that trauma, to get help, to get support, so that we don't continue to live in this sort of victim consciousness. Because what can happen is, when we continue to live in a victim consciousness, the abused can actually become the abuser. But what happens when that goes unhealed is we continue to filter different situations that happen in our life through the story of that trauma, even if the situations that happen in present day reality aren't representative of that actual situation that happened. But again, this is happening because our body is trying to find a way to heal that trauma. And so when we really go through a really big trauma spiral, really the way I see these is, this is the body's way of recreating a past situation in the body in order to try and finally heal that trauma, that wound, or that break in connection. So say there's something that happens that is not exactly what we experience in that main core trauma in the past, but it has some sort of feeling somatically that elicits and activates some sort of past memory, right? So even if the present day situation, let's say, is a small portion of that massive trauma we experienced when we're younger, that is enough to potentially activate a past memory activate something to the surface that is trying to be healed. And so when I say a trauma spiral, really what that means is that there's a present day situation that has happened that is recreated and reawoken and activated a past trauma in the body that hasn't actually been healed. And now what we're doing is we're filtering this present reality through the lens of that past trauma in a way to try and heal it. For example, say there's a breakup, right? And say it's a contentious breakup. Say it's not a super loving, amicable breakup. Guy and girl break up. Girl has a lot of trauma with the father wound, right? And say they break up, and in the wake of that breakup, it activates all her father wound stuff. What could happen, and this is where a trauma spiral could happen, is that she actually now sees her ex as her father. So all the compounded emotion that is, and this is very common in breakups, in divorces, where there's triggers and there's contention and people are hurt and there's difficult feelings and emotions. And so all the trauma that has been unhealed to dad gets reawoken. And now she essentially sees her ex as her father. And this is her body and her reality's way of trying to heal that situation. But what happens that we only actually heal it if we go to the pain and the hurt. So there becomes an option here. We can recycle the same dynamic, or we can actually surrender into the unworthiness, the pain, and the hurt. We can surrender into the heart of the trauma. And typically what happens in our life is we have so many different recreations of trauma experiences that become opportunities to break the cycle. Where the break in connection has happened, we can actually mend that through actually moving into the pain and the hurt. And then we move into a trauma spiral. Something's awoken that's in the past, and we spin, we derail, we sabotage, shame, guilt. This is where regret happens because we behave in ways that maybe we don't think we're the most graceful or don't think we're the most of integrity. And so a trauma spiral becomes an opportunity to mend the break in connection or to continue to repeat the pattern. And so this continues to happen in our life, particularly relationally. When relationships don't work and we continue to replay certain dynamics, there's something that's being awakened in us, is asking us to go inward, internal, to mend that connection rather than continuing to repeat the cycle. And so the trauma spiral is very much when something has happened present day that has reactivated something somatically in the body. And trauma spirals become really, really destructive when there's a really disproportional situation that's happened present day that has awoken something from the past, that now we're filtering that present day situation through that really charged, unhealed, compounded trauma from the past. And now what happens is we're in a total spin out, a total destruction. Something has happened. We, can be really angry. This is again where victims can become abusers because there's some type of activation of something from the past, and they continue to disproportionately, because of the trauma, move into a form of destruction. So again, this becomes an opportunity for healing. Sometimes we filter reality through a story. It doesn't mean the main situation that we experience wasn't very real. But what happens is there is truth, but there's also story. So when it comes to trauma spirals, we're dealing with truth and we're also dealing with story. Because what does happen when we have a lot of unhealed trauma, that we continue to kind of find ways to slot our reality and our perception of reality in certain ways so we don't actually have to go to the core root to heal the pain of that trauma. Think about it. Situations happen, and that core wound or that core trauma essentially gets activated in a certain way where we come right up to that situation, right? We come right up to that situation. And that's where the opportunity comes. Are we going to surrender into the hurt? moving into processing the abuse we experienced, or the unjust or unfair experience, or the pain or the longing of something we didn't receive? Are we going to surrender into the pain or the hurt of that? Or are we going to, ooh, that's really uncomfortable, I'm going to move away from that and find a way to now filter my reality, the lenses and ways that I perceive the situation that is occurring, that is disproportional, right? Potentially disproportional or not totally accurate if we were to take a totally neutral observational viewpoint. But we're going to now filter what happened through our trauma as a way to survive, as a way to protect ourselves, as a way so we don't actually have to feel the core root. But again, what happens here is we can live in self-destruction, we can live in aggression, we can live in very cutting, very hurtful sort of behavior. The abuser or the victim can become the abuser because that pain is triggered and we want to attack and we want to hurt whenever any sort of exposure of that pain is going to come. So again, these opportunities come. With trauma spirals, there becomes an opportunity. But typically what does have to happen is, often with big traumas, we do have to experience a recreation of that experience. We have to experience where something happens, even if it's just processing with a somatic therapist or processing with some sort of practitioner, or there's something that happens where that trauma is activated or recreated. And now the healing comes when we learn to work with that trauma in a new way. Because trauma healing is essentially healing something old in the body under different circumstances. So what I mean is that we're healing something old, but the conditions have changed in the body. So we're recreating something old, something really deep and painful in the body, but we're now experiencing it under different conditions. I would say more safety, more capacity, more better preparedness to actually heal that through the body, right? And so that recreation, again, that breakup where the woman sees her ex-boyfriend as dad, that's now necessary for her to try and heal that relationship to her father that probably elicited and created that dynamic to begin with. But the work is now, are we going to descend into the hurt and the pain, or are we going to continue to spiral and spiral and spiral in a loop, right? And again, the reason why we spiral, the reason why we continue to exist in some form of a trauma spiral, a trauma spin out, sabotage behavior, this sort of idea where, self-sabotage, where we continue to move into what we want and then we derail it. And the reason why we're doing that is because we're trying to protect something. It's become a learned behavior of self-preservation. And ultimately, the learned behavior of self-preservation is so that we don't actually have to feel the pain of the trauma to begin with. If you think about a trauma spiral, it's a survival mechanism so we don't have to descend into the pain of that hurt. And so when we're moving through our life, when something gets activated or reactivated, there's probably some disproportional where the situation that activated is not totally accurate to the situation, but it's reminded the body some semblance or variation of some past experience that now needs to be healed. And what happens is we can experience a massive charge and this crazy overwhelm of emotion in a certain situation. Maybe it's anger, maybe it's fear, maybe it's grief, maybe it's this crazy dysregulation to some sort of situation that has happened that has awoken this as an opportunity to heal. And typically there's going to be, maybe even a bunch of different forms of recreation of this trauma until we're actually ready to heal it. And then what happens is, we move into this trauma spiral, and then at some point we're able to realize, we're able to catch it, and we're able to move into that pain or hurt. And so really to deal with the trauma spiral is actually this real surrender and descent into our unworthiness, into our hurt, into our pain. And this is really where we can actually shift like a victim consciousness to really move into total ownership and accountability that this is something that I need to take care of. This is something that I need to work at. This is something that I internally need to take responsibility for. Even if it's an unjust, unfair experience that happened to me, I can't continue to now filter my entire reality through that story, right? Because what does happen when that continues to linger and we don't actually heal that trauma, we do continue to create stories. And at some point, that trauma becomes our own self-fulfilling prophecy, so we don't actually have to feel the hurt, so we don't actually have to heal. And that just continues to create trauma spirals and spin-outs and spin-outs. And typically when we're in a trauma spiral, we're going to be really dysregulated. We're going to be super activated, probably overwhelmed with emotions like fear, rage, grief. We're going to experience a lot of difficulty regulating our emotions, and probably we're going to be responding to something that has happened, right? So we're responding to something present day that, you know, maybe has a portion to do with present day, but it's actually about something else. And I'll tell you this, most breakups that happen when we really have difficult experiences, so much of them aren't actually even about that breakup. Yes, we experience heartbreak and we can do a lot of healing, and then we experience really clean heartbreak, but so often a breakup and this, you know, real sort of victim consciousness that happens after a breakup is some type of past memory or past activation of some compounded experience from our past that we haven't healed, right? So typically these recreations are very, very common in breakups, where all that we haven't actually healed, the different traumas, the breaks in connection, become recreations in these moments. And we actually descend into the hurt and the pain. We actually move deep, deep into the unworthiness. And we don't avoid it. We don't fight it. We just surrender into it. And we take responsibility and accountability for it. And we move into the tenderness, the graciousness, and the lovingness within ourselves. Then we actually heal and break the cycle. And so a trauma spiral in one end becomes actually necessary, that we sometimes do need to have a recreation, a present day recreation of some past memory. That essentially what's happening, it's our body's bid to heal, to mend that connection. And healing trauma is about digesting a past experience under different present day circumstances. When I say different present day circumstances, I mean a newfound, deeper capacity in your body's actually now ready to digest that experience. But often we can experience trauma spiral after trauma spiral after trauma spiral, you know, maybe smaller ones, you know, become bids to heal, but we're not actually ready. So we continue to spiral, we sabotage, we make the same patterns over and over. And then maybe there's a really, really big rupture that happens that now this recreates a past experience, which really gives us an opportunity to heal. But trauma spirals can be very, very destructive, but they can also be absolutely necessary and the most magnificent opportunities to now heal a past experience in a different current landscape in the body. And it's just dependent on whether we're willing to surrender into that pain, or we're going to project from that pain, move into self-preservation and survival, which is probably how we've learned to move forward to get to this point. But if we want to disrupt the pattern, heal the pattern, and finally heal that past memory, we have to descend all the way into the heart of that pain so we can now break the cycle of that trauma spiral so that it doesn't happen again.